Charles Darwin questioned everything when it came to the origin of species and the evolution of life here on Earth. And that questioning led him into some pretty dark places. Places most of us would rather not venture into for fear of what we might find. He often found exactly what he was looking for, too, be it in the contours of a barnacle's shell or the beak of a mockingbird. There was also times where his questions unearthed more questions until his shovel slammed into the greatest question of all, just below the surface. He knew it was there, but he'd hoped to avoid it. But of course he couldn't. Fearing what he would unearth, he continued to dig until he found a box and opened it. And this is what he found.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Darwin or design? That was the debate on everyone's lips in the years following the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Charles himself preferred to sit back and let others fight the battle for him. And it's not that he wasn't capable of fighting. He was, after all, a very intelligent man, but he was also a quiet man. And as we've established in the last couple of episodes, he was somewhat of a homebody. He preferred the quiet solitude of his study and his books to that of a lecture hall. He'd much rather be home with his family or resting while Emma played the piano. For him, it was better to let Thomas Huxley, Alfred Russel Wallace, and others speak for him and the validity of his work. They were more than willing to do so, and they understood what his work ultimately implied just as well as he did. Every argument in opposition to his great theory had its bedrock on one real item of concern, perhaps the only item of concern. If Darwin was right, and the complexity of life evolved from one common ancestor, an ancestor who wiggled out of some ancient pond billions of years ago, then what about God? Where was his hand in all of this? Surely God's contribution wasn't that wiggling little precursor to life. And even if, as some would eventually say, or try to say, that God helped evolution along like a wizard behind the scenes, replacing natural selection with a bit of divine selection, it still didn't reconcile this with the origin story that had already been established, that being the story of Genesis in the Old Testament. It was there in black and white for everyone to read. There in its pages, it states unequivocally that God created the heavens and the earth, as well as everything under the sun, including man in his entirety, in 6 days. And what of that? Where did it state in the opening lines of Genesis that God formed the earth, sat back, and then hoped for the best? Of course, the answer is it doesn't say that at all. So the conclusion many came to was that Darwin must be wrong, horribly and heretically wrong. He must not be believed. We can't forget that Darwin started out with his eyes on becoming a country parson. Not so much by his choices, his father's kind of pushed him in that direction. But if he had become one, he would have been a quiet servant in God's service. One didn't have to go far to find evidence of God either. You didn't need to step on Paley's watch in a field to do so. You only had to get on your hands and knees and to watch a beetle on a blade of grass to see it. And what an amazing creature when you think about it. What an amazing creature a beetle is. How perfectly it's designed for the life it leads. It has a hard shell to protect itself from danger, and if need be, it can draw that shell back to sprout wings and escape. How could nature do this without help from God? Darwin was of the mind early on, as was his wife, that nature couldn't do it without the help from God. His wife remained in awe of God's work, while Charles himself reluctantly set foot upon a path that took him deeper into nature, so deep that he began to see what was really going on. Everything was connected. Everything struggled to survive, and the only way to ensure survival was to adapt. And with every adaptation or modification came a test. Pass the test, and you continued to produce offspring, or continued on to produce offspring. Fail the test, and, well, as Darwin grew more and more certain that nature was fully capable of producing the abundance of life around us without the assistance of a deity, the more he became afraid to say anything on the subject. Sure, he'd say how descent with modification enabled organisms to survive, and he'd talk about them passing on those modifications to their offspring, but he wouldn't go as far as to say what all of this really meant. He wouldn't publicly contradict the story of Adam and Eve, at least not in those words, but it was certainly implied in his work. He just hoped nobody would notice. But he knew it was a dull hope and that they would, and of course they did. So the letters came in. Letters were in praise and some were in condemnation, and other letter writers were simply curious, such as the one he received from mathematician Mary Boole.
Do you consider the holding of your theory of natural selection to be inconsistent with the following belief that God is a personal and infinitely good being?
One can imagine Darwin sitting at his desk, his writing desk, with a blank sheet of paper, perhaps adjusting his glasses, and he must have stared long and hard at that sheet of paper before crafting his response.
My opinion is not worth more than that of any other man who has thought on such subjects.
He probably paused and then continued.
I am grieved that my views should incidentally have caused trouble to your mind, but I thank you for your judgment and honour you for it, that theology and science should each run its own course, and that in the present case I am not responsible if their meeting point should still be far off.
Whether or not Mrs. Boole was satisfied with his response is unknown. In his letter, Darwin did say with considerable angst that he found the presence of pain and suffering in the world evidence of nature's dominance over our lives. Even though suffering seemed to be in opposition to that of an omniscient God, he would never be so bold as to suggest that God did not exist, at least not out loud or in a letter. But to himself, and perhaps to his wife Emma, he might whisper his fears that if there was a God, then maybe, just maybe, he did start it all. Maybe he gave the earth a few good spins to keep it revolving around the sun, and then left. The idea that God started it all and then played no further part is deism. Deism, or some form of it, it's been around for centuries. It picked up steam in the 16th and 17th centuries with the Age of Enlightenment and the rise of scientific knowledge. Whereas mankind and his home had once held a special place in the cosmos, one at the center of it all, science had shown us that perhaps we weren't as special as we once thought. Not only did the universe not revolve around us, but we lived our lives in obscurity upon a mediocre planet, which revolved around a mediocre star, which existed in the spiral arm of a mediocre galaxy. We were as far from the center as one could get, and as unnoticeable. If we held any place in God's thoughts, it might just be as an afterthought. The more Charles learned, and the more he studied, the deeper his conviction grew that humanity was simply another species of animal living within the thin biosphere of this planet. We, like every other living thing, had evolved from simpler living things. His grandfather Erasmus Darwin had been right.
Would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament?
With the publication of On the Origin of Species, the gauntlet had been tossed, as Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo did to move the Earth away from the center of it all. Charles did the same thing for man. If he was right, and anyone would be hard-pressed to prove him wrong, mankind wasn't that special after all. We were special in the sense that we were the only species on the planet, perhaps the only species in the entire universe, to form the type of consciousness we have, a consciousness which leads us to question our very beginnings. And when you think about it, that questioning might be a curse, or that ability to question might be a curse. We are also the only species to recoil at the possible answer. From a primordial pond to a few wiggling bacterium, to an ancient fish seeking to escape predators and to eat in peace, we had forged our way through the ages to the stage we are at now. Where it will all lead, no one can say. And unfortunately, there is a time limit on how far we can get. The sun won't last forever. It will eventually burn out or explode. The future of mankind aside, this wasn't what Charles was concerned with. His concern was of the past and of our origins. He was concerned with the price his family might have to pay for his boldness in the eyes of man and in the eyes of God. If he had been somewhat of a recluse before, it was so much easier now. He still dealt with anxiety and stomach pains, and he still preferred to answer inquiries by letter and to have his friends and colleagues visit him at his house in Down, rather than to make the long trip to London, which he still did occasionally. But he much preferred to spend his days at home, with Emma and with the children, pursuing the next question or adding more bricks to the citadel that was natural selection. And of God, Charles preferred to take the stance that French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace did when asked by Napoleon why God did not appear in Laplace's own great book. Laplace's reply,
"I had no need of that hypothesis."
As far as the hypothesis went, the one held by Charles evolved as well. Whereas he would have aligned himself with deism in his younger days, by 1879 his views had changed. In a letter written to John Fordyce, author of the 1883 book Aspects of Skepticism, Charles wrote,
My judgment often fluctuates. Whether a man deserves to be called a theist depends on the definition of the term. In my most extreme fluctuations, I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of a God. I think that generally, and more so as I grow older, but not always, that an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind.
The term agnostic was coined by Darwin's own friend and supporter, Thomas Huxley, in 1869. It basically states that questions about the existence of God are unanswerable. An agnostic neither believes nor disbelieves. It was that view that Charles Darwin would hold for the last 3 years of his life. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material and also ways to support this show at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to hear from you. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.